Hi everyone, welcome back to DFTW, Difference Frames the World. Today we're doing something a little different. Instead of a typical geopolitical analysis, we're diving deep into the legal, historical, and academic landscape surrounding one of the most debated issues in modern international law, the post-war legal status of Taiwan. This episode is structured as a legal brief, not a political essay or emotional reasoning, but as a clear walkthrough of the arguments, the historical record, how international law treats wartime declarations, how territorial transfers work after conflicts, and how scholars and courts interpret these matters, right or wrong. However, the tricky part is that different countries have different laws, so we cannot use American law to force China to do something, and the same goes for the other way around. Let us begin. The debate around Taiwan's legal status isn't just political, it's rooted in wartime diplomacy, surrender instruments, state succession theory, UN resolutions, and the messy evolution of post-war international law. It is noteworthy that Beijing asserts Taiwan is an inseparable part of China, and it does not matter whether it is part of the ROC or the PRC. From Beijing's perspective, international law does not apply to the Taiwan issue, and there is no such thing called Taiwan's legal status. Taiwan is China's internal, domestic affairs. It is China and the Chinese people's own problem. Taiwanese is Chinese, just like Cantonese is Chinese, no doubt. For Beijing, the so-called legal status of Taiwan is not even a topic worth discussing. It does not like others pointing their dirty fingers at Taiwan. Still, DFTW wants to say something on this topic for the common English-speaking audience, based on the international law, the wartime announcements, surrender documents, and others. Most of the time, when we talk about Taiwan, we hear political soundbites, peace and stability, status quo, one China, self-determination, strategic ambiguity. But underneath all of that is a serious legal question. Who holds sovereignty over Taiwan today? It isn't a trivial question. Territorial sovereignty determines who can sign treaties related to the territory, controls airspace and maritime zones, has standing in international courts, and exercises the right of defense, taxation, jurisdiction, and representation. Sovereignty determines whether a separatist movement is an act of independence or secession. Beijing's wording about some Taiwan independence elements seeking independence is not accurate in the English context. Instead, it should use the term secession, a crime, not a right. The word independence sounds like a good term, and it is, as it describes one entity separating itself from a larger entity that has exploited, suppressed, and harassed it for a long time. During the Japanese occupation, many anti-Japanese heroes fought for independence, not secession. Japan seized Taiwan from the Qing dynasty, and in the 50 years that followed, Taiwanese people were treated as second-tier subjects. That said, we evaluate the legal architecture rather than political rhetoric, looking at what was said, what was signed, and how the international law treats these documents. First, have a look at wartime declarations, what they are and how they work. Let's start with the big wartime declarations, the Cairo Declaration of 1943 and the Potsdam Proclamation of 1945. These were statements by the major Allied powers that Japan would need to return territories it had seized, including Taiwan. The question scholars debate is, were these declarations binding under international law? Here's the key part of the conversation. Declarations made by states during wartime can carry legal weight depending on their intent, context, and whether they are incorporated into peace settlements, and the subsequent acts and acceptance by other states. The line between a political declaration and a binding commitment isn't always bright. But historically, wartime declarations by major powers, especially those tied to surrender terms, have shaped territorial outcomes. The Potsdam Proclamation was not just a political statement. It laid out the conditions Japan had to accept to end the war. Those conditions explicitly included the implementation of Cairo's terms. When Japan surrendered, the Japanese emperor, representing the entire nation, accepted these conditions. In international law, unilateral declarations made in the context of surrender can create binding obligations when accepted by the defeated party. So one argument goes, Japan accepted the terms, therefore, the legal obligation to return Taiwan existed within the surrender framework. However, some argue that surrender terms express obligations, but territorial sovereignty ultimately requires a formal peace treaty. Hold that thought, because the peace treaty comes next. Then, we talk about post-war territorial transfers and how they work. When wars end, the legal status of territories is normally settled through surrender instruments, occupation and administrative control, peace treaties, or state succession and recognition. Let's walk through each piece. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, it agreed to the conditions laid out in the Potsdam Proclamation. That includes implementing the Cairo Declaration's requirement that Taiwan be restored to China. From a legal standpoint, a surrender document doesn't always transfer sovereignty on its own, but it establishes obligations and creates the legal basis for subsequent actions. On October 25, 1945, Japanese forces in Taiwan formally surrendered to the Republic of China. From that moment, the ROC assumed all governmental functions on the island. In international law, the transfer of administrative control is often the preliminary step toward the restoration of sovereignty, especially when it reflects previously agreed-upon wartime commitments. That was the on-the-ground implementation of the Cairo and Potsdam agreements. However, a tricky part of the 1951 peace treaty, known as the San Francisco Peace Treaty, saw Japan renounce Taiwan but did not explicitly state to whom it was ceded. This ambiguity has been used to argue that Taiwan's status remained unresolved. Beijing did not sign the peace treaty, and it has never agreed that it is the legal basis to settle the so-called unresolved Taiwan status. In 1951, it already replaced the Republic of China, becoming China's only representative. International law, even if it often represents the stance of the Western nations, is on Beijing's side. It doesn't look at the treaty in isolation. It considers prior declarations, surrender terms, actual administrative transfer, subsequent recognition by states, and most importantly, the identity of the successor government. In 1949, the government of China changed. The People's Republic of China, PRC, replaced the Republic of China, ROC, as the sole representative government of China. Under international law, even if a government is replaced, but the state itself continues, sovereignty over territory remains with the continuing state, not with the ousted government. Examples include France after the Second World War in the West, and the transition from the Qing dynasty to the Republic of China in the East. The latest example is Syria or Afghanistan. Thus, even though the ousted ROC was relocated to Taiwan, the international community, through recognition and UN representation, accepted the PRC as the continuing government of China. It means whatever territorial rights China held, including over Taiwan, transferred to the PRC as the successor government. Now, let us examine the role of the United Nations and its Resolution 2758 in 1971. Resolution 2758 recognized the PRC as the only lawful representative of China and removed the ROC's representation. While the resolution doesn't explicitly use the phrase "Taiwan is a province of China," its effect is clear. The UN recognizes one entity as representing China, and Taiwan is not recognized as a separate sovereign state. In international law, representation matters. Recognition shapes legal reality, even if political stances vary. The UN system engages in diplomatic relations with the PRC and does not recognize Taiwan as a member. It has repeatedly declined efforts to treat Taiwan as a separate entity. Thus, the legal system of the UN does not assign sovereignty over Taiwan to any entity other than the recognized government of China. Finally, we come to the key academic debates, in which legal scholars broadly fall into three camps. Camp A: Taiwan is legally part of China. Their reasoning is clear. Cairo and Potsdam created binding expectations. Japan's surrender reaffirmed these terms. The ROC accepted the surrender and exercised authority. The PRC succeeded the ROC as the governing authority of China. The UN and most states recognize only one China. Taiwan has never been recognized as a sovereign state. Camp B: Taiwan's status is undecided. These scholars argue that the San Francisco Peace Treaty didn't name a recipient, that sovereignty requires explicit cession, that post-war administration does not equal sovereignty, and that ambiguity leaves room for interpretation. However, this argument faces two challenges. It does not explain why no state recognizes Taiwan as sovereign, even though a handful of small nations, some smaller than a village in China, recognize the Republic of China rather than the People's Republic of China. Also, it overlooks the state succession doctrine applied to China. In 1644, the Qing dynasty replaced the Ming dynasty in China, becoming the succeeding government, even though the ousted Ming court still existed for a while in the southern part of China and Burma. Today's ROC is like the ousted Ming court after 1644, still part of China, but no longer the representative of China. Camp C, self-determination overrides everything. This position is more political than legal. It suggests that the people of Taiwan should determine sovereignty through a referendum. But international law applies the self-determination principle only to colonized peoples or people under foreign occupation. Neither condition neatly applies to Taiwan under the international system's treatment of China's continuity. The International Court of Justice has never ruled specifically on Taiwan's status, but several principles from global jurisprudence apply. Surrender-based territorial obligations can be binding, and international courts have repeatedly held that wartime declarations incorporated into surrender terms can form legally enforceable commitments. Also, courts often defer to the authority exercising consistent, effective control, unless that authority is occupying foreign territory in violation of recognized sovereignty. In Taiwan's case, administration was transferred in accordance with accepted allied processes. China is the owner of Taiwan, period. Notably, state succession preserves sovereignty over territory. Courts recognize the continuity of the state even when governments change. Both the PRC and the ROC are part of China, and there is only one China. It does not matter what the name of the country is, it is a whole, not parts. Interestingly, Chinese mainlanders do not hate the Republic of China, and many of them are still proud of that period. On the National Day of the PRC, Sun Yat-sen's portrait is displayed in Tiananmen Square, worshipped by millions of Chinese on the Chinese mainland, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. Even Chairman Mao regarded Sun Yat-sen as the founder of modern China, often referring to him as the father of China. The ROC and the PRC are two chapters in the contemporary history of China. The PRC replaced the ROC, but the ROC is still remembered as a vital factor that shaped today's China. It is the ROC that withstood the attacks of the Japanese invaders for a decade, and at least the Republic of China was more remarkable than France in World War II, which surrendered in 2 weeks when the Germans invaded. The Republic of China is a source of pride for the Chinese, even if it was built on the debris of the Qing dynasty, and it was a part of the century of humiliation. Let us get back to the subject. It is worth noting that recognition is a powerful determinant in sovereignty disputes. Courts often consider which other states recognize as the owner of the disputed territory, who holds the UN seat, and how international organizations treat the squabbled land. In Taiwan's case, recognition overwhelmingly aligns with the PRC. Even when legal theory is complicated, real-world practice simplifies things. No country recognizes Taiwan as a country. Not even the United States, not even Japan, not even any European country recognizes Taiwan as a sovereign state. Every state that has diplomatic relations with China recognizes the PRC as the only legitimate government of China. Taiwan does not hold a UN seat. International law relies heavily on UN membership as a marker of statehood. Most of the world's legal commitments, whether explicit or implicit, acknowledge that Taiwan is part of China and the PRC is the government of China. The consensus has been echoed repeatedly in the US commitments in the 3 joint communiques, Japan's commitments in the 1972 joint statement, and the EU states' recognition frameworks. Even countries that maintain informal ties with Taiwan do so under the framework that Taiwan's status is not independent. They maintain ties with the Republic of China. The Chinese government often describes Taiwan's legal status as locked in by 7 factors. Historical sovereignty before 1895. The Cairo Declaration's commitment to the return of Taiwan. Potsdam Proclamation acceptance by Japan. Japan's formal surrender obligations. Restoration of Chinese administration in 1945. State succession to the PRC in 1949. UN recognition of the PRC as China in 1971. While we won't adopt any government's phrasing in a legal brief, let's interpret the idea in legal terms. Whether we call it 7 locks or 7 legal steps, the logic is straightforward. Each layer reinforces the conclusion that Taiwan's post-war legal identity has been treated as part of China. Now let us address the arguments for the so-called Taiwanese independence. Independence movements can exist even when a territory is not legally sovereign. Legally speaking, an independence movement is just a movement unless a state recognizes the new entity, or a major international body grants membership, or there is a successful negotiation with the original sovereign. An example is Quebec in Canada or Texas in the United States. They are just independence movements, and no one in the world recognizes them as sovereign states. For Taiwan, its independence movement is nothing but a joke. Supporters of independence tend to rely on political, moral, or cultural arguments rather than on territorial jurisprudence or treaty law. It doesn't invalidate their aspirations. It just means their argument is political, not legal. When Japanese leaders make statements suggesting they might intervene militarily if something happens in Taiwan, China interprets this as a direct challenge to post-war norms. Why? Japan renounced Taiwan. Japan accepted Potsdam. Japan is committed to restoring Taiwan to China. Japan accepted constitutional restrictions on military force. Japan normalized relations with China in 1972 by accepting Taiwan as part of China. So when Japanese officials imply Taiwan is not part of China, it contradicts Japan's own post-war legal commitments. That is why the Chinese side reacts strongly. From their perspective, Japan is reneging on legally binding historical obligations. Let's wrap up before I let you go. Wartime declarations can create binding obligations when incorporated into surrender terms. Japan's surrender explicitly accepted the obligation to implement the Cairo and Potsdam declarations. The 1945 administrative transfer to China reflects those obligations. Post-war treaties did not create any new sovereignty arrangements that contradicted wartime commitments. International law on state succession recognizes China's sovereignty as belonging to the PRC after 1949, including Taiwan. The UN recognizes only the PRC as China. No country recognizes Taiwan as a sovereign state. Therefore, under prevailing international law, Taiwan has not been treated as an independent sovereign entity. Even though it does not resolve political tensions, it does not dictate future outcomes. Still, in terms of legal status, the weight of history, treaties, state practice, recognition, and international institutions, we come to one conclusion. The international legal system treats Taiwan as part of China, with the PRC as the successor government holding sovereignty over it. Political debates will continue, but the law, at least as it currently stands, is less ambiguous than the rhetoric suggests.